Hello, and welcome to Train Signal. I'm Don Jones, and this is the SQL language lesson in the Database Administration Fundamentals course. SQL, or Structured Query Language, is the language that SQL Server takes its name from, and in this lesson we'll talk about some of the basics of that language. We'll focus on really three different portions of it: DML, or Data Manipulation Language, DDL, or Data Definition Language, and Control Language. Data Manipulation Language, or DML, is the portion of SQL that is used to issue queries to retrieve or update data in the database. SQL Server uses Transact SQL, or T-SQL, which is a proprietary variant of the industry standard or general SQL language. For the most part, T-SQL is compliant with various American National Standards Institute, or ANSI standards, for the industry standard or general SQL language. The first SQL query that most folks learn is the select query. This is designed to retrieve one or more rows, including one or more columns apiece, from the database. Various clauses or additions let you filter, sort, and otherwise restrict and manipulate the data during the retrieval process. So at the bottom of the screen here we have a customers table. That's the name of the table, customers. This has 3 rows of data, and each of these rows has 6 columns of information associated with it. If we issued the query select name, phone from customers, where city equals big city, then we're only going to get those rows of data where the city column contains the big city phrase, and we're not actually going to even get that city in our results because we've said we only want the name and the phone column from the customers table. An insert query adds rows to the table, and you have to specify values for all columns that do not provide a default value and which do not permit null values. Both defaults and whether or not nulls are accepted are things that you define as part of the table's design or schema. For example, insert into customers. Okay, now we need to tell it what columns we're inserting. We're going to insert the name and the phone columns. And the values we're going to put into those are Margie Smith for the name and 5551515 for the phone. The values are listed in the same order as the column names, so it's very important that those match up. You can see in our customers table at the bottom of the screen, we have added a new row at the bottom. This one has the customer's name as Margie Smith, and her phone number is listed. The address, city, and state all contain null values because we didn't provide a value for those, and obviously the database's schema did not provide a default value for those, but it did permit the null values. If for some reason it did not permit a null value, our query would have failed with an error. The 20 in the ID column is created automatically by the database schema. So we did not have to provide that value in our query, but the database was able to create that value for us. An update query changes the value in one or more rows for one or more columns, optionally based on some criteria. For example, update customers tells SQL Server to update the customers table, set city equal to BIGGE city, where city equals BIG city. So this goes into our customers table, finds every row where city contains big city, and changes that value to a new value. The delete query removes one or more rows, and optionally, and usually based on some criteria, if you don't provide criteria, you wind up deleting every row in the table, which could get you in trouble with the boss if you're not careful. For example, delete from customers where ID equals 18. We'll go to the customers table, locate the row where the ID column contains the value 18, and then remove that row from the database entirely. Now for some data manipulation language extras. The merge query performs an insert, update, or delete based upon the results of another query, commonly something called a join, which we'll be discussing in a later lesson. The various commands, select, insert, update, delete, and so forth, offer a great deal of additional complexity and capability, and it's worth your time to look them up in the SQL Books Online, which is SQL Server's documentation, so that you can see all of the different things you can do with those 4 basic queries. Constraints are something that a database designer puts into the design or schema of a database to restrict the data that the database will accept. Any DML operation that would violate one of those constraints will fail with an error, and the change will not be made. And there are a variety of different types of constraints that a database designer can use to help make sure the data in the database is consistent and correct and what it's supposed to be. DDL, or Data Definition Language, is the second major chunk of the SQL language. This is used to manipulate the schema or design of the database, to create tables, modify indexes, and so forth. The ANSI standards cover very little DDL, although most database vendors have kind of converged onto similar conventions. SQL Server, again, uses a variant of the SQL language called T-SQL or Transact SQL. One of the most important DDL commands is use. This changes the database context. In other words, you might issue the command use my database in order to tell SQL Server that, hey, everything after this point should be targeted against the my database as opposed to another one. Keep in mind that SQL Server is fully capable of containing multiple different databases. A given user can only be connected to one database at a time per connection. So the use command changes the database that you are using. Further commands will run against and affect that database. When you connect to the SQL Server initially, you generally connect to the default database that has been configured for your account. If you need to work with a different one, the use command lets you change to any database that you have permission to work with. Some other DDL commands include create, which creates an object like a table or an index, alter, which modifies an object, such as to change the data type or size of a database column, drop, which removes an object, truncate, which removes rows from a table and reclaims free space. Now that contrasts with the delete DML command, which removes rows from a table but does not reclaim space. You see, freeing space requires SQL Server to do a lot more processing, so truncate can take significantly longer to run. Now, SQL Server does eventually reuse the space, even if you run delete, but it does so piecemeal, which can result in something called fragmentation. For example, let's say that these pages are the 8 kilobyte pages within one of your tables. You decide to use the delete command to remove some of the data from your database. And so let's say that happens to grab these 3 rows based on the rows you decided to delete. So those pages are gone now. Now when SQL Server's ready to start adding new data to the database, it's going to try and reuse some of that free space, writing in new pages into the blank areas. That causes fragmentation. These pages are essentially out of order now. It's almost as if you took the phone book, ripped all the pages up, mixed them up into a different order, and shoved them back into the binder. And now when you need to look something up, you've got to flip back and forth instead of being able to go through in a nice orderly progression. So over time, fragmentation can reduce SQL Server's performance, and you have to do something called defragmentation to put the pages back in the order that they're meant to be in. Once you start filling in lots of these different blank spots, fragmentation gets progressively worse and worse over time. Truncating works a bit differently. Here, you're still removing a bunch of pages, but rather than leaving that big blank spot in the middle, SQL Server also rearranges the pages to reclaim that free space. That way, new pages are created at the end of the data where they belong. So the data is less likely to become fragmented and more likely to stay in the correct order. That takes more processing when you do it, but it helps prevent the need to periodically defragment the database. In reality, you're going to have to do that defragmentation eventually anyway, but if you're going to be removing large chunks of data and you have the ability to give SQL Server some extra time to work with it, truncating can be a way of putting off that eventual defragmentation just a little bit longer. Here's an example of the create DDL statement. We're going to tell it to start by using the production DB. Go tells SQL Server to process the previous command, and so it's going to switch to the production DB and then create a table called customers. This will include 3 columns: ID, name, and city. ID is an integer, name is a variable length character of up to 50 characters, and city is a variable length character of up to 50 characters. All 3 of these carry the constraint not null, meaning when new rows are added to this table, a value must be specified for each of these or the command will fail. The onPrimary tells it to create this table on the primary file group, so the physical files in which this is stored. Here's an example of the alter command where we're changing the customers table. Here we're adding a varchar20, so maximum of 20 characters field, named city, which is also not null. Drop is used to drop entire objects, not just columns. So here we're deleting everything from customers and then dropping the customers table entirely. SQL Server also includes a control language, which is additional programming style language constructs used to make logical decisions, repeat specific tasks, and so forth. T-SQL is similar for the most part to other database vendors' language implementations. There are no standards for database control languages. However, because the control language is very firmly on the software development side of the industry, we will not be covering it further in this course. In this lesson, we've covered the basics of the SQL language as it applies to Microsoft SQL Server. We talked about DML, or the data manipulation language, and the 4 core queries: select, update, insert, and delete. We also talked about the DDL, or data definition language, and we briefly covered what the control language is, although we won't be covering the control language any further in this course.